Happy Tuesday to our viewers who are tuning in. The next installment of our In Bloom Political Education series that we have been engaging in throughout this summer. It'll be wrapping up soon, but we have a few more conversations, including today about housing and rent and what that landscape is looking like in Tennessee, but namely in Memphis. So I'm really happy to be in conversation with another fellow Memphian, Mauri Pinckney, who is the co-director and lead organizer with the Memphis Tenants Union. And so, for folks who might have stumbled across Healthy and Free's page and not as familiar with the work, my name is Brianna Perry, she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director at Healthy and Free Tennessee, a statewide reproductive justice organization working to grow the movement across race, class, and gender. And we're working at the intersections of criminalization, surveillance, and reproductive oppression to really push for and expand access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive healthcare services and ensure that families remain together and that families and communities and pregnant people can thrive in their environments and have access to all the services and resources and supports in order to do so. And so, one core tenet of the reproductive justice framework, and again, we've really been exploring that this summer, issues that relate to our policy priorities, but also further get into the expansiveness of the reproductive justice framework, which includes the human right to maintain a pregnancy, the human right to not be pregnant, to prevent a pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy, and also the human right to live and thrive in safe and healthy communities, and the human right to bodily autonomy free from all forms of oppression. And so, when it comes to what all is needed to live in a safe, thriving, and sustainable community, housing is so key to that. So, today we're going to be getting into that and what changes are happening. I continuously am encountering people like rent is too high, like what is going on, like people are being pushed out. And so Mari's going to really get into that with us today. So thank you again, Mari, for agreeing to be in a conversation with us, and I'll just turn it over to you to tell us a little more about yourself and the work that the Memphis Tenants Union does.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here today. Thank y'all for the work that y'all do in reproductive health. It's definitely needed, especially with everything we have going on during this time. But again, I'm just really glad to be here, and I'm glad to tell y'all, what's going on in Memphis as far as housing goes. I'm glad to be able to speak with a fellow Memphian. So shout out to Memphis, and we're gonna go ahead and get this started. And so I'm Mauri Pinckney. I'm the co-director and I'm a lead organizer with the Memphis Tenants Union. I'm 26 years old. I was born in Florida, but I've been raised in Memphis for, majority of my entire life. Previously, before I accepted a job in nonprofit and housing, I was a teacher and I taught 3 through 5 for the past 2 years. And I became a full-time organizer, staff member this July. So again, just thank you for having me here, and I'm excited to talk about housing and the work that we're pushing in Memphis. And so just to go in a little bit more of a background about me, I am a renter. I'm a tenant, of course. That's how I got involved with this work. In 2023, I lived in an apartment that unfortunately I experienced a flood.
Mm.
And while, the water was leaking all through the walls, it of course soaks the wall. It goes all under the carpet. It's probably like a Friday afternoon. I'm calling the management office, not
Mm.
getting any response, of course, because they're going home for the weekend. Call emergency maintenance. They're like, okay, we'll put in the report. No
Mm.
emergency services though are rendered. I went the entire weekend basically with kind of water still in the floor, of course, in the walls. And I just grew frustrated with that because I really felt like, if I'm calling and I have a major flood, we already had like found mold in the apartment and other areas. So I'm super worried about the water just kind of, getting trapped, creating more mold, possibly causing me to be sick. And so, I'm calling the landlord, I'm calling the owner, I'm calling the management company, whoever is supposed to be in charge of the building. And it doesn't, they don't come until the following Monday. They come with like this giant air dryer to basically just dry up the carpet, which I had already kind of done myself. I had bought several fans, kind of just positioned them towards the floor and the wall to kind of get it to dry a little faster. And so with me having to, of course, like purchase fans out of pocket, I'm like stressed about. I've had to purchase things out of pocket. I still have to pay my rent. You guys
Mm-hmm.
have not, moved me into another apartment that is functional and working. You aren't fixing the solution. They're not pulling up the carpet. They're not investigating the walls. They're not doing any type of, checks. And so I'm just, increasingly growing frustrated because again, I'm a teacher. I'm, paying my rent. I'm working a full-time and a part-time job. I'm maintaining a lot as a single person. And it just, I wasn't seeing the answers that I thought I was supposed to see. And I'm probably about maybe 23 at this point. So I'm still fairly young, still, new to the world, trying to figure out, what is this giant thing I'm doing. And so I had seen on Facebook a girl that, was speaking out about similar issues that she was having. We had the same landlord. And so we ended up connecting off of that and we met and, talked about the similar issues we were having. They were having, pests. I was having pest issues, random fees. They don't come fix, maintenance repairs. And so
Mm-hmm.
she invited me to meet with the Memphis Tenants Union, which was already a smaller group, kind of already doing work. And I was attending, of course, looking for help, not trying to become an
Yeah.
organizer or a volunteer. And unfortunately, when I did meet with the Memphis Tenants Union, they were like, we're glad to have you, but there is no real protections for renters in Memphis or in the state of Tennessee. So you can
Mm-hmm.
imagine my surprise because again, I'm still fairly young and, politics is still, new to me. I probably voted one presidential election. So I don't really know, the ins and outs of what I think I should know, but I do know, what I have going on right now is causing a lot of stress on me. And so that is how I got engaged with this work. I ended up looking for help and I just became a volunteer. So for the past 2 years, I've been a full-time, volunteer outside of my part-time job, of course. And that's how I've just been, working with the Memphis Tennis Union so far. So that's, my own personal story into housing, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
always important to highlight when you're talking about, this work and how you got into it. We need to
Mm-hmm.
always be telling our own personal testimonies because we do ask of others to tell theirs as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all that, Mari. And I definitely agree with you, especially when it comes to like how we impacted, by these issues that we are trying to advocate on behalf. And, like you saying, like, hey, actually, this came up when I was like renting this apartment, there was this flood, and I was trying to get like support, someone to come fix it, was calling all these numbers, and no one showed up. And you went to Memphis Tennis Unit Union to get resources, but like, hey, like actually the people who are disproportionately impacted by these issues should be the ones who are in these organizations and bringing other people also with them. And so, coming for resources, but it's like, hey, actually, and I hear that in a connection with someone else, like, oh, somebody else been impacted. Oh, actually, there are other people, who are experiencing this as well, and how, like, through that connection, like, building power and trying to think about what protections can exist. And so that's something that I think is important, but also just kind of like this point around like there are no real protections for renters, not only in Memphis, but across the state of Tennessee, and how like that continues to cause problems. And when it comes to like, hey, like this is going on with my unit, and where's the maintenance, and you're trying to like go and get some recourse, and it's like, oh, actually, it's limited things that can happen. But folks who are impacted and really like becoming a part of these groups, like, oh no, actually, like this is how we can put pressure and like different things in place to offer support for folks like us.
Yes,
um
all of that. Yes, yes, yes. And that's
mhm,
like you said,
mhm,
that's what we should be doing. We should be bringing in people into these spaces who are having these issues. And it's
mhm,
like, hey, stick around a little longer. I know you want your issue fixed, but also, do you want to become a volunteer? Because, like I said, everybody has a testimony, and that testimony can
mhm.
help us, gain this collective power that we're seeking for tenants and
Mhm.
tenants' rights.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you already like spoke to like basically non-existent protections for renters. But I am curious, because again, it becomes like such a big question. Like I used to do Black Mama's Bailout work in Memphis, and housing was like the number one issue that would come out and actually led to people being incarcerated. And something that folks will ask, well, what are housing assistance programs that exist? And so yeah, I just want to invite you to share like what are programs that exist for Tennesseans and Memphis, but other parts of Tennessee that people can turn to when they're experiencing problems or trying to get support with rent, etc. Just housing assistance programs overall.
Yeah, I totally can talk about that. Like you're saying, housing is usually it can be the lead cause to people being incarcerated because if you don't have somewhere to stay, more than likely you're going to be outside, and outside you're going to get, involved with things that will lead you to incarceration, and or you simply being unhoused is the thing that caused you to be incarcerated because we do know that they're arresting the unhoused and sending them to prison for not having enough resources. So yes, a few programs that we do have in Memphis. We have the Section 8 vouchers. Of course, that's that's unilateral. Most places offer Section 8. We have an organization that is called Friends for All in Memphis, and they do have a few programs geared to rental assistance. They have a tenant-based rental assistance program, an emergency financial assistance program, and a short-term rent mortgage utility program. We also have the Comprehensive Emergency Assistance Program through Shelby County Community Services Agency. And for homeowners, MIFA has a program that will assist you with your mortgage, and any other programs as far as housing goes are usually geared for the unhoused. So, those are like, for people who don't have anywhere to go. They're not looking for assistance. They just actually don't have anywhere to go. So you have places like Union Mission that offer space to men. Dorothy Day House, that's a space that opens, for women and children. Hospitality Hub, they're open daily. You just have to kind of get there in a certain amount of time, and it's first come, first serve. So those are just some, programs off of the rip that we have in Memphis that service, tenants with financial assistance.
Are there any specific eligibility requirements tied to these programs and being able to access them?
Yes, of course. So most of these programs do have, eligibility requirements. I will say I do know some churches also have programs. They might not be these official programs, they might not be available for all, residents of the city. Of course, if you're a member of the church, they probably have, some type of fund that they can offer
Mhm.
you maybe one time. So I do want to also mention we do have, some churches in the area that offer housing financial assistance for their members. But for Section 8, the requirements are of course, you must be low income. You have to be disabled, elderly, or your family size and your income. Again, those are like the requirements. Friends for All, their programs have different requirements per program. So
Mhm.
the tenant the tenant-based rental program, you have to have a landlord requirement and the landlord has to approve. For the emergency financial assistance program, you have to be Ryan White certified. For the short-term rent mortgage utility program, they offer that tri-state, which is Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. You must be on the lease or the account holder for the mortgage. You have to show proof of household income for all members as well. So that is something a little bit more kind of, it doesn't just affect Tennessee. You can get that, of course, if you live in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi. There are certain counties that are, included. And for the Comprehensive Emergency Assistance Program through Shelby County Community Services, the income must be 20% lower than the federal poverty guidelines. And you have to have an uncontrollable circumstance, which they're going to defend on their website as a provable circumstance that was just uncontrollable, something that you literally couldn't have planned happening, such as maybe like funeral expenses, job loss, unexpected repair or replacement of a large appliance, and or a medical expense. So those are just the basic requirements for any of the programs that are in Memphis.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think what comes up for me is like so many people fall outside of those eligibility requirements. Um, Back in 2021, we did some watching at the eviction
Mm,
court in Nashville, and just like hearing people's stories where, they probably wouldn't have qualified for Section 8. And it's just like, hey, like I can't, pay rent. And like, yeah, due to the pandemic and what supports like existed and how then that shifted and people were like in this position where maybe they were like if they found themselves unemployed, they were able to get another job
mm.
and maybe, it was at the same level of income or different, but also, and I'm thinking about like in Nashville where going back to like rent is very, very expensive. So even people who like they would not qualify for this assistance, but they still can't afford like 2,000 plus for rent. And so it's more so just like a reflection. So I think about those eligibility requirements. I also think about like, how do we update them? How do we think about what the current needs are for people? And yeah, like by and large, like what rent is supposed to just account for what 30%, less than 30% of your income. But for so many people, it is going over that. And even people who are like homeowners, like not being able to afford any of it. So that's just like something that I think about when it comes to like those requirements because I'm like, oh, like how to like there needs to be some shift there because so many people can fall outside of those requirements.
Yeah, totally. That is definitely a good point. Like you're saying, you can basically make 50 cent above the poverty level, and now you don't qualify for Section 8 because your income is not going to be, under that threshold. And so that's definitely something that is very important to talk about. And like you're saying, we're finding out that everyday people that do have jobs that are supposed to be salary, good paying jobs, teachers. I was a teacher and could not find housing in the city of Memphis. It actually caused me to be displaced and to be
Mhm.
unhoused for a few months out of the year. From about October to December, essentially, I was unhoused. Thankfully and gratefully, I had a friend's mom and dad who let me stay at their home with them, and I could, kind of save up potentially any money and then move out. But as you're saying, every day people are basically saying the rent is too damn high and I can't afford it. And like you're dating it back to even COVID to when, of course, we're seeing people losing jobs. We're all stuck at home. We don't know what's really, going on and what is to come. And like you're saying, if I make this salary at my job and I lose my job, it was not a guarantee that you would go and find a job with the same salary that could provide you, with some stability. And so, like you're saying, where rent is supposed to be 30% of your income, we're seeing that rent is usually about 50% of an income, even
Mm.
sometimes more. And so that's why, like, it's really important when we talk about these guidelines because little things can happen. You can get a 20-cent raise. and now you don't qualify for Section 8. So where does that leave somebody that's basically, you could be making, because federal income poverty level for a family of one, which would be me, is $15,650. I can't even imagine having to like make that low amount of money and then still be like, okay, I have to like pay my bills, I have to eat. Like that is so low. And then when we're talking about minimum wage in the state of Tennessee, it's still $7.25. So
Mm,
again, I want better for myself. I don't want to just work a $7, a hourly job that pays me 7.25. Let me go find a job that pays $9, but now I don't qualify for Section 8 anymore. So it's putting
mm,
people in a position to almost have to decide, am I going to, be self-sufficient on my own, or am I going to have to rely on the government to, provide me with some type of resource? And then when you're looking at that, the resources that the government are providing, they're not quality. We see that Section 8 is usually in what they deem, horrible parts of town. The crime is usually high. The apartments usually aren't up to date. Maintenance isn't getting done. So it's really causing a lot of stress on people. And we're seeing that
mm,
especially in the city. And like I'm saying, I was a teacher on a salary and I could not find a place to move when I had to move out of the apartment that flooded. So I ended up becoming displaced in a house. And, it really was a wake up call for me because I didn't realize that, this is what life would be like. I really, thought I would graduate college, I would find that job, I did,
mm,
everything that was basically told to me to do.
mm,
And
mhm,
now I'm still finding myself in a position of I don't have money and or I did have money and it all went to my rent and now I'm struggling
mm,
in every other area of my life. So yeah, again, like I'm saying, some of the requirements require social security cards. And so that's an issue with people who are, immigrants because per se, your mom has a social security card, your dad doesn't, but all the other kids in the household do as well. That one person now has caused that entire family essentially to be ineligible for, any assistance. And that's just not right. You know what I'm saying? And
mm,
when we're talking about immigration, that's something that's very, prevalent in what we're seeing, and especially in politics. Immigrants are paying taxes because they don't get government assistance. They don't qualify. This one requirement is removing a whole household. So if you're thinking about, oh, well, they're taking our jobs and they're taking our homes, they're actually not. They're actually coming and they're, doing their due diligence and they're still, of course, being, coming up short because they just don't actually even qualify when you look at some of these requirements.
mhm,
ID proof is requirements for some of these programs. If you've been
mhm,
unhoused for years, you probably do not actually have identification. And so now we're going into again, how are these people supposed to pay for an ID if they haven't had a job in years and they're already unhoused? We're
mm,
literally basically charging poor people to be poor. And it's really just sad to see because it's not just what we deem as, low income. Middle class people are suffering the exact same. The rent
mm,
is
mhm,
too damn high. This is not a poor issue. It's not a poverty issue. This is becoming a class issue. And because class is not, organized, we're seeing all of these kind of holes and people are falling short. And it's really,
mhm.
just causing a lot of harm and issues in the city and in our communities.
Yeah. Woo, yeah. You said a lot there. And I do think like there are opportunities here and to your point around like sometimes and I definitely am there with you where it's like, oh, I did everything. I went to college and stuff and I'm seeing article come out every day after day, like the job market and people aren't able to get jobs. And again, like what does that mean for housing and like these other basic necessities that people are coming up against. And so I do appreciate you saying like let's widen this. Like people are like, okay, housing. If you're don't have housing, you must be poor, you're unhoused, you don't have a job. But it's like, oh no, like actually there are people who maybe like yes, they are like working poor. They're at the minimum wage like line and minimum wage jobs. And then there are also people who are teachers and other like, so-called like higher paying like professions and still are struggling to pay their rent. And so I really appreciate you highlighting that. So my the next question I had, and we're already getting into like what are barriers that exist when people are trying to access housing assistance. And so you mentioned like ID, like social security numbers, cards. And so just want to see if there are other barriers that we haven't touched on yet that come into play that people face when they're trying to access the housing assistance that you mentioned, like Section 8 and other assistance. Yeah. What are some other things people face that are present as a barrier?
Yeah, like I already, started talking about social having to have a social security card can be a barrier. The real ID is now becoming an issue because of course I'm in the South. Jim Crow was definitely a time period where black people didn't get birth certificates. So how am I supposed to prove to you that, I qualify for an ID if I don't even have a birth certificate and I need the ID to get the home? So that is, definitely an issue. Section 8 is a whole issue in itself just because, it's government regulated and we're seeing that the waits are long. You will be on a Section 8 waiting list for years. What are you
Hmm.
supposed to do
Hmm.
between those years you're waiting? Are you supposed to just be unhoused and living on the street? And we're not even getting into families. I can speak for myself. I'm a single woman. I don't have any children. So I've been able to maneuver things a little bit easier. But to imagine, having a child and not being able to afford rent and then not knowing where my next, home is, that's very stressful. So the waiting times for Section 8 are just completely outrageous. The apartments that they offer, they're not of good quality. They're not in good areas. The schools in the areas are not, good. So you're really looking at a lifelong battle of just kind of constant struggle because at any point that you hit, your housing is going to be an issue as well as these other issues. Again, minimum wage in Tennessee is 7.25. And I know people are like, well, there aren't jobs that are paying 7.25. Yes, there are jobs that are still just paying
Hmm.
7.25. It's legally all they have to pay. So why do you think that these corporations that their only, goals and margins are profit are not going to squeeze all of that out of somebody? Because they definitely are. There are still jobs that are paying minimum wage. And so again, like I stated, let's say you get a raise. Let's say you get a $2 raise. You go from 7.25 to 9.25. You are now ineligible for low income Section 8 housing. Do you want the raise from your job or do you want housing? Like I said, they're really, squeezing people for whatever they have. And what we're seeing is, of course, in a city like Memphis where there is close to little to no affordable housing, people are, being unhoused. They're being displaced. They're being evicted. To be evicted is to go to court and to basically have to pay more than what you already could not pay when you went to court. So it's like,
Hmm.
what really are we giving people to have to be like, you can have a home? And it seems like it's honestly nothing. And that's, what we're fighting against, day in and day out, because the reality is that everybody can have a home. I think that that is something that is like some type of idea that people see it as like so far out of space. And it's really not. Everybody could have a home. Because
Hmm.
when you look
Hmm.
at the way Section 8 works, the government gives apartment owners, these, landlords, slumlords, they're giving them a lump sum of money to cover the other part of the rent. So if the government is deeming an apartment to be $1,000, which we know that the apartment is actually not worth 1,000, if they're subsidizing 800 of that, even 900 of that, and only saying, well, you only have to pay 100, To me, that seems like there is, ways to where
Mhm.
everybody could qualify for a housing voucher. Now, you might not get an $1,000 housing voucher, but everybody can qualify for a voucher to where, hey, you get a $300 voucher and you can take that and pay your rent. It's something, and what we're seeing is there is nothing. So, I think that we're in a time where we have to be, real about what we can have, and we
Mhm.
can all have housing. Housing is a human right, it is a basic
Mhm.
necessity, as you've clocked. And so, for the government, for other people, for anybody to say that, we don't have the money, we do have the money. We just have to place it, strategically in a way that will provide for everybody. And that's just unfortunately not how Section 8 works.
Yeah, providing for everybody. Yes, that's what it's about. And I really, really like that. So Mari, what were you saying? You kind of already gotten into this a little bit when you talked about a little bit about displacement, but what would you say are some other structural issues that prevent expanded housing assistance? And so, like with displacement and gentrification and that happening, like Nashville, like I mean, like whoa, in
Ciao.
Memphis, and I'm thinking about just like certain neighborhoods in Memphis. I'm like, what is this neighborhood now? And
What is it? What really is
yeah, and discrimination or just other things that people well, structural things that like structural barriers at this point that prevent expanded how access to housing assistance. If you could speak more to that.
Yes, like you're saying, the main thing that we're seeing, which is all over, is gentrification. Shout out to TSU. I definitely, spent my first year of college at TSU. And so I go back to Nashville and I'm like, what is happening? This does not look like the school that I went to. The area is changing and it's all changing so fast. And so,
Mhm.
definitely gentrification is definitely a main issue we're seeing in Memphis. Of course, Memphis is a primarily black city. So, like you're saying, these neighborhoods that our moms and grandmothers and great grandmothers grew up in, South Memphis, Binghamton, we're
Mhm.
seeing, developers come in, buy your grandma's house for pennies, flip it, remodel it, whatever, they say they're doing, and then market rate it for an astronomically high price for that area. Like we're seeing $1,400 homes in South Memphis in Glenview, where I know my great grandma literally built up her house in that area. And I'm like, my great grandma didn't make $1,400. She probably didn't make $700. She might not have made $300. You know what I'm saying? But we're seeing that that is prime real estate. It's close to downtown. It's close to midtown. It's close to the U of M. They want these prime real estate areas so that other outsiders can come in the city and can kind of what they call boost the economy. They love to say, oh, we need people to come in and make more money, and then we can raise the taxes and we can raise the rent. But in reality, all they're doing is outpricing residents that have been in Memphis for their entire life. So, like I'm
Mhm.
saying, they are not building family homes. That's another thing that we're not seeing. There is not much development for single homes. What they're doing is they're building apartment complexes because they're trying to, again, squeeze as much finances out of people as they can. They want as many people in those apartment buildings. They want them paying as much rent as possible so
Mhm.
that they can make a profit. So when you think about it, why are they building apartments instead of homes? Because they're not going to build you a home that you can afford. They're not building you an apartment that you can afford, and so they build these apartments. They'll give them off as Section 8. And the only reason they do that a lot of the time is for the developer, whoever is making the apartment owner, so they can receive tax breaks from the city. That's something that we've seen as well. When you claim that you're offering Section 8 housing, you can get tax breaks. So these companies are really spending little money on the building. It's, they're not good quality buildings. And then they're also getting money from taxpayers, and they're basically getting that and putting that directly into their pocket. And then they're taking that money and going completely out of the city and out of the state. So we're not even seeing that revenue back in Memphis, as sometimes a lot of these companies promise. They love to say, oh, we're going to, give back to the community. We're going to make sure that we are,
Mm,
donating funds. And that usually never happens. They
mm,
always take the money and they take it, to wherever they live in their nice homes and fancy houses and condos. And they do things like that. City officials, again, out of state developers are responsible for a lot of the gentrification that we're seeing going on.
mm,
Again, environmentally, we're seeing environmental racism heavy in Memphis. That's not anything new, but with the presence of XAI, the data center by Elon Musk, it is in a
mm,
primarily in historically black neighborhood. Boxtown has been there. It's in the most southern, corner of Memphis. Again, city officials signed off on a deal allowing Elon to purchase a massive piece of land for a
mm,
giant supercomputer that is now causing environmental harm to a large community of black folk in Boxtown. You know what I'm saying? And
mm,
so this supercomputer, they're saying, is now going to require water from our aquifer that services the entire city. So we're seeing a surge in electric bills due to a giant supercomputer that,
mm,
everybody's like, oh, I love ChatGPT. But ChatGPT is honestly killing people. You know what I'm saying? And who is paying for those, surges? It's not Elon Musk. It's not XAI. It is the city, the taxpayers, the residents of the city of Memphis. We're seeing electric bills, rising, and people are,
mm.
why is my electric bill so high? And I don't even be at home all the time. And I turn my AC off. I unplug this and that. It doesn't matter because that supercomputer is funneling so much energy. Somebody is going to have to pay for that. And unfortunately, it falls on the residents, the taxpayers, the people that live in the city of Memphis. Again, no affordable housing. What are people supposed to do when they're making these low wages and cannot afford rent? Again, there are some programs, available to people, but, in some of these programs, you have to prove, proof of foreclosure or eviction, like really causing people to get to like the very end of something
Mm,
before I can
mm,
receive any type of assistance. And it's really disheartening because, you can only imagine the stress of somebody that, you can't pay your rent, your groceries are high, electric bills are high, and I'm like looking for help. And it's almost like there really is, just no help.
mm,
Again, wage inequalities. Memphis is a lot of blue collar. We have FedEx, Amazon, UPS,
mm,
all of these, warehouses, but they're not paying people livable wages. And people are, really breaking their backs, using their physical bodies, at these jobs. And you're working 40, 50 hours a week, and you're going home and you are still not able to pay your rent. And, another thing that I love to bring up is like, for a black person, the median income is 41,000, and for a white person in Memphis, the median income is 70,000. That is a $30,000 difference, which makes all of the difference when you are talking about not being able to live and pay your bills. We're seeing that,
mm,
FedEx is a large corporation that, is probably the largest employer for the city of Memphis and for black people in this city, and they cannot make ends meet. And that is not something that, is done by accident. It's definitely
mm,
done by design. They are giving black people the lowest paying jobs and saying, make it work.
mm,
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And there's not enough saving, there's not enough couponing. It's not enough to just not be in poverty. And that's honestly just what it is. People are poor, they are living in poverty, and they don't have a place to stay. They don't have food to eat. So where does that leave them? It leaves them honestly just outside. And so when you're talking about these structural issues, you have to focus on the fact that, Memphis is a primarily black city. And if this was
Yeah.
not a primarily black city, you would not be seeing the things that you're seeing. So when they talk about crime, they love to, talk about black on black crime, but they don't actually talk about the structural issues that causes that said black on black crime. And, even the usage of the term black on black crime, it's like that's not even a real
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You are in community with people. So naturally, the crimes are going to be committed in the community that you live in. So, they try to paint it as something that, is you can work your way out of, or you can go to college and it won't affect you, or if you, maybe take this job, you won't have this issue. But in reality, you're still going to have those same issues, regardless if you work at FedEx, regardless if you're a teacher,
Mhm.
regardless if you work at the city of Memphis, you still are going to be in that general pot of struggle. And I think as a class, we are not organized on that matter. There is so much, disenfranchisement, and we're not able to come together and, really collectively create power and change the things that we want to see. Because, like I said, it is definitely possible for everybody to have a home. It is not
Mhm.
something that is so far out of space that you can't imagine it. But they like to, city officials, the White House, people, they like to, individualistically make it seem like it's just a you issue. But if you go
Yeah.
outside and talk to five people, I could bet you're going to talk to five people that can tell you that they're having issues paying their rent. So it's not, a singular issue. It is a collective issue. And honestly,
Mhm.
until we come together and really tap into our power as a people, as tenants, as a class, we're not going to see the change that is needed to actually kind of shift the power dynamics that are at play.
Yeah. And yes, you again, you said a lot there. And I do appreciate well, there like was so much that you highlighted, but one thing, well, what I will start with, as you were talking about XAI and back in June we were in conversation with Tracy at Young, Gifted, and Green, and she was,
Yes,
talking about
yes,
environmental
yes.
racism and the connection to reproductive oppression. And like this piece around like the like utility bills, like the like electric bills, and how okay, if that's going up, that is like, and you kind of have no control over it. That is tightening the resources that are available to you to either pay rent, or if you're a homeowner, like property taxes, all these other things. So I appreciate you pointing out that, like, that they're like also especially in this environment related to like AI expansion and what's going on with the supercomputers, where it's like literally these things outside of your control can, come into your neighborhood. These corporations can come into your neighborhood, and your bills are going up, and now you can't, afford things that maybe you could. I mean, it still could have been like a tight squeeze, but now it's like, okay, I'm now in a position where I definitely can't afford my rent, or I'm like having to make these very hard choices. Like, okay, do I like prioritize rent, or do I prioritize groceries, or like my electric bill, per se? Because some people's electric bills can be very, very up there, where it
Yeah,
is like, like,
$500.
yeah, that's what I'm saying, like half, or but of a rent payment, or who knows. And so I do appreciate like that connection as well. And I have heard people talk about it kind of like separately, but I'm like, oh, okay, as we connect it to housing, like this is very much so like, I mean, it's this housing justice issue where like the supercomputer is in Boxtown, and then also like how people are put in a further position where they aren't able to afford rent and to like maintain their housing. So I really appreciate that that you like uplifted that, and just like again these other structural issues, and like you said, like, when it comes to like being able, like qualifications related to Section 8, and how they can so easily shift. We also did a conversation around public benefits, and I was someone at Tennessee Justice Center who and I guess there were other things that came up related to that. But in this particular conversation, it was like, hey, yeah, like, eligibility, like if this one thing changes, then eligibility for you, like you shifted out of it. And like you said, like it could be very minimum. Like I got this like very, very small raise where I'm like outside of this window, outside of like the threshold, but hey, I still cannot afford my rent. And something else that I think about is and I'll talk about this a little more at the end, especially like, what folks can do to get involved. But going back to like housing and how it has such an impact, a huge impact on people's like well-being and livelihoods. And I saw it with the Black Mama Spell Out campaign. But this year we launched our Poverty is Not Neglect campaign to make it clear that conditions related to poverty are not, child neglect. And so
Mhm.
when it comes to like, people having like housing, and as you mentioned, adequate housing, because you could have housing and maybe there's mold, and then like the child gets sick and someone calls um DCS, and now there's a report, and it's just like, what? I'm trying to like get the landlord to come fix this. Like this is, and just how it puts people in a position of like their families being separated. So like not having housing or not having like adequate housing is a pathway to you losing custody, potentially losing custody of your children. And so I just like also like wanted to uplift that as a part of these structural issues, like just like the impact of it. And again, as more and more people are like I cannot afford my rent, and it's not the people that folks think it is like
It's
has
you and me.
typically
It's
been.
literally you
Right,
and me. Like
exactly.
literally. I'm
Yeah,
like,
and it's
no,
like,
I don't know what
yeah.
y'all think they look like, but they look like me. It's me.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So
Yeah, and so like
definitely.
building that solidarity. So I really appreciate you uplifting it as well. Where like if like a better organization as like a class of folks who are, just like when we think about just the working class in general, but also when it comes to like rent and like not having housing as a human right, and just like more people are going to lose housing, they're going to be experiencing evictions. And so again, just like how like that's going to be very devastating, and how can that serve as like a potential opportunity to build in a different way.
Yeah.
So yeah, so Mario, you already kind of got into a little bit like some of the changes you want to see. And so yeah, just wanted to see like what are some other changes when it comes to housing assistance programs, changes you want to see related to that, but just housing in general. What will you say would be helpful to ensure that Tennessee families are able to get the support that they need, are able to get the housing that they need?
I definitely think, requirements are gonna have to change. I like I don't have the answers. There is no solution right now for, what does it look like to make these programs better. So honestly, I just think requirements kind of need to just everybody should be eligible. You know what I'm saying? Like these
Mhm.
requirements are so small and narrow that like you're saying, you get a $2 raise and now you're kicked out of, your Section 8 voucher program and now you're supposed to go look for market rate apartments and there are no, market rate apartments in Memphis are going for $1,100. I went from, barely even having $600, but now you want me to pay 1,100. So I think,
Mhm.
what we're honestly just going to need to see is a true just shift in the housing just all together. We're gonna have to really just kind of gut it and we're gonna have to start from the bottom, from square one, and build what we want back up because we can try to change these systems that are in place, but the reality is that these systems are working the way they're designed to. There's
Mhm.
nothing that you can change about something that is working the way that it was intended to work. This is not something that, oh, it just randomly happened. No, this was a plan. This was planned out
Mhm.
to get people to this point. And so when we talk about, how can people get involved? Unions. I think people don't, unions are like an idea, but people don't actually know like how they work because a lot of the times when you talk about unions, people are like labor unions. And even then you have, people who critique labor unions and they're like, labor unions aren't that good. And, that might be true. But the best way that we're going to see a real like shift and a cultural change is to have class solidarity. Working class people are going to have to come together, and it's going to have to be the working class. I'm seeing, reports that there will be no middle class, soon. So if you're not in the middle class, what class are you in? You're working class. You're a working person that goes to work. You work 40
Mm,
hours a week and you're not going to be able to come home and pay your rent. It's not going to be, oh, I thought it was, no, it's going to be you. It's going to be me. It's going to be us. And so what that looks like is creating, collective tenant power. And that is what, Memphis Tenants Union's whole goal is to do. We are, completely, we're excuse me, our like I said, our main goal is just to again create tenant unions in the city of Memphis to create collective power amongst the working class, to help educate those who have been unseen, unheard, forgotten about for years, to bring them into community with one another, to show them, hey, this is what you're going through and this is, the best way out. And so again, like I said, building a tenant union is the best way that, Memphis Tenants Union feels that we're going to see a change as far as housing goes in the city as well as the state. So people are going to have to come together. People are going to have to door knock. We have our main project is Memphis Towers Tenants Union. It is,
mm,
in a
mhm.
what they call the medical district in Memphis, prime real estate area. It's close to downtown, close to midtown, close to the hospitals. It's a very good area. But those people, went years struggling. I mean, no hot water, no
Yeah.
AC, no security, pests, doors being open left 24 hours, harassment from staff. The list just goes on. And those, tenants at Memphis Towers grew tired of people slamming the door in their face. You go to the city officials, you go to City Hall, you go to these meetings, and they don't say anything. They don't do anything. They don't reprimand, the landlord or the owner. They actually give them, the city is giving them tax breaks. So,
Mhm.
you have to hold the people accountable who, are supposed to be taking care of these things. And like I said, with Section 8 being, HUD affiliated, who's enforcing HUD? So
Mhm.
that's another aspect that you're looking at. It's like, you can put in a code enforcement complaint. Code enforcement can come to your apartment. They could look at it, they could file, but who's going to, make sure that those things stay on top of, their game? We've seen that, the people that this is their job, the officials on boards, the city officials again, the people that are supposed to be, taking care of this, they're not taking care of this. And people again are struggling and it's really causing severe harm. Not having stable housing will kill you. It just honestly will. And it'll kill you in a way that you probably weren't even, ready for, like you weren't even anticipating for it. But it slowly will do that to you because that stress again of just not having
Mhm.
a home, it is not good on a body. It's on the human body for any being.
Yeah.
And so,
Mhm.
again, we got to get back to those, communities. We have to get back to talking to one another. We have to get back to
Mhm.
door knocking. We have to get back to knowing our neighbor. People don't know their neighbors. And you think your neighbor is your enemy, and you're completely missing who the enemy is. The enemy is somebody you'll never see. You don't ever see your landlord. You don't ever see the owners of these buildings. You don't ever see
Mhm.
these politicians, at these places with you. And that is exactly who you should be gearing, your anger to because they have the money to fix the issue you're going through. They don't care. Like I said, in the apartment that I lived in when it flooded, it took me
Mhm.
to move out for them
Yeah.
to come in and fix the apartment. That is ridiculous. Why do I have to leave when I've been here for the whole year paying rent? Why do I have to leave for you to say, oh, okay, we'll pull up the floors, we'll pull up the carpet, we'll, fix the walls? Why is that the nature of housing? And it's because class solidarity is just not organized. People are not organized. Again, primarily
Mhm.
Black city, blue collar jobs. People are working 40 hours. They're tired. So you're asking them to, come out to something else. It is a very hard, thing to organize down south. And that's something that I definitely want to, amplify, for all my Southern organizers. Like,
Yeah,
yes, this work
absolutely.
is hard, but it is doable and we have to do it and it's needed. And so we just have to honestly push forward and again, create these tenant unions, go at these landlords with all that we have and let them know that we're not going to, take this. We're not going to keep paying the rent and we're not going to keep fluffing your pockets and I can't buy groceries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mari, for all that you shared and being on today. And then also just saying like, hey, like actually there, maybe there could be shifts, but we really need to build like people power in order to think about our path forward. And so I really appreciate your time today and we're gonna definitely put links and resources related to Memphis Tenants Union and just how people can, read more about like just like housing related issues in general, historically, redlining and how they like tracks with today. So yeah, just really appreciate your time and you sharing your experience and expertise and just encouragement to like, hey, like we can stand up and we can organize together and build together. So yeah, thank you so much. And just looking forward to continue to build like with you and the work you're doing in Memphis. And yeah, we just really appreciate you and I'm really grateful for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank y'all so much. And, before I go, I definitely, anybody that's watching, if there's a tenant union around you and you're, looking to, become involved, text, call, go to a meeting, see what's going on. The best way to get involved with your housing is just to go and do it. So, you're going to have to go to a meeting. You might have to go door knock. You might have to talk to your neighbor. These things, we're not doing them in vain. They do mean things and they are, going to help and build up communities. So, any advice I have for anybody, just trying to get, engaged with housing, join a tenant union and let's get to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Mari. And again, we'll make sure like all like the links and what you're up to gets dropped. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank y'all so much. Have a good one. Thank
You
you.
too.